So I'm going to do a little painting demonstration, painting this painting here of some dried grass on a table, just a real quick, simple still life. I painted it with the Geneva Artist oil color, using just the 5 colors in the Essential palette. And without further ado, here's me painting the still life. So I've painted this from life, and I set it up in a little shadow box about 4 feet away from me. And I'm just putting in a few marks. I used a proportional divider to just to put in some basic marks that I can use as guidelines. And I usually do this to some degree, especially if I'm doing something symmetrical and perfect like this glass vase, which really there's almost no abstraction in the shape itself. There's plenty of abstraction in the way the reflections play. But the shape of the vase itself is a perfect shape, and so that's why I put in some marks for me to look at, so if I could get it close. But then the rest of it I just kind of sketched in. So I probably spent maybe about 15 minutes or so doing this little bit of penciling, and then I'm done. Now I'm mixed up some colors, which I did not show you. But I mixed up a palette of colors, and again, this is how I paint. It's not necessarily how you would paint if you're starting out for the first time. There's plenty that you can learn from watching me paint. The basic principles are the same, but I don't check my colors nearly as much as I would recommend somebody starting out would, and all kinds of things like that. But if you're advanced and you've painted a while, maybe this is sort of what the method has become for me, and that is I don't check much. I trust my instincts more. I allow myself to play with shapes and colors, and as you're going to see in this demonstration, I end up painting this background about 3 or 4 times. I was never happy with it, but just to start with, I was really just trying to paint the pattern. Actually, when I first started painting the background, I was really trying to paint the cloth the way I saw it, but it didn't turn out that way. So putting a little bit of background around the jar is why I painted the background, not because I wanted to paint the whole background first. But now I'm going to go ahead and paint the jar, and I'm going to need a little table color around the edge too. It's always a good idea to put some background around something because it allows you to bump the lines around. If your vase is too big, you can bump it smaller with some background color, and vice versa. If your vase is too small, you can push it into the background. You can go either way. And also, it's really important to have something to look at. So if you were starting out, I would recommend you put background around the whole thing. But I take all kinds of liberties, and I really intentionally try to paint this exactly as if the cameras were not on. I was not trying to paint a lesson or paint a painting for a lesson. I was not trying to do anything specific other than have some abstract subject matter to look at, and then just do my thing and try to paint a nice little still life that I liked. And so as you can see here, I'm pushing the background in to make the vase a little smaller, not quite as wide, and also to straighten up my lines. And that's a huge advantage to having the background put in. Don't ever try to paint something without a little bit of background color to have. And normally I would paint every last bit of background around it, but now I'm just now putting in the table. But the more you paint, the more liberties you can take, the more you understand what you're doing. And at this point in my career, I just jump all over the place and don't follow my own rules that I teach to my students. But most of those rules there's very good reasons to start that way. And until you really understand color, it's important to go slow and to mix your color lines and everything else. The way I mix my palette for this painting was very quick. I didn't mix all the steps that I would recommend that my students mix. I just mixed a few. And I always play with my color, as you can see. I'm always adjusting. If I don't like the color, the way it looks, on the canvas, then I'll make an adjustment. And this is something, and this is really speaking to somebody who's starting out or somebody without a lot of experience. But you don't want to take liberties, because you can put paint on a canvas and it'll look completely wrong to you. Don't go and change it. The only way you should be making judgments about color if you're starting out is with a color checker, or if you're working from a photo by wiping a little bit of color on a laminated photo and checking it that way, because that color checking like that will really, really, really teach you to see color. But with my experience, I do all kinds of stuff when I play with the color. The table might look too green now, and as a matter of fact, if I try to explain to you why I left it green, it's really sort of advanced. I tend to like to leave things slightly dirty, slightly. If I see purple in the tabletop, I can come back and put purple back into it, and then I get a little dance of color between the green and the purple, or the yellow and the purple. So I'm just filling in on the vase here. As you can see, I'm always working dark to light, not in a perfect way, but I would recommend to my students that they, to the best of their ability, to try to work dark to light. So I'm really trying to paint the little black areas in the vase. Now I'm going to my next step. As you can see, one more step from black. But basically building it dark to light. And I do that to this day. I almost never, ever will put in my lightest colors. They're really hard to work with. And if you put in the lighter colors, they will pollute your shadows. You have less room to bump things around and play once you get those lighter colors put in. So I try to really only work with the darker colors as long as I can, and really hold off on putting those colors in that have a lot of white in them. As you can see, I'm working with the really dark colors here, and no way am I going to put a reflection in now, because it's just, I may need to bump the reflection around. I may decide the position's wrong or whatever, and as long as I don't have all those light colors in, I can play and bump this vase around if it's too fat or too tall or whatever. It's real easy to do. And never think about whether glass is transparent or not transparent. So people ask me, well, how do you paint things that are transparent? Whether it's a transparent sleeve on a lady's arm, or a glass vase, or whatever it is, that there is no such thing on a canvas as transparent. You don't paint transparent. Everything you paint ultimately becomes opaque. It's two-dimensional. So therefore, the way you paint things that are transparent is you mix the color that you see and you paint it on the canvas all in one go. And if I were to go out and check those colors that I'm painting in, they should match pretty good. And I just paint them in, and it doesn't matter. And if you paint in the right colors, the transparency will magically appear. But there's no such thing as trying to paint transparent, where you put in one layer and then try to paint a transparent layer on top to create some sort of illusion of glass. That's not how you create the illusion of glass, or a transparent fabric, or anything else. The way you create that illusion is just by putting in the right colors. Plain and simple, one layer. Alla prima. You can do it in multiple layers, of course, but you can do it just as well with a single layer, because ultimately it's just color. That's how a camera does it. That's how, when you make a print from a camera and it comes out of your printer, it's doing the very same thing. There's no transparency. It's just laying in colors, and those colors give you the illusion of transparency. So as you'll see, we're not showing all the palette shots. There's plenty of times I'm going to the palette that we're not showing it, but I play with my color constantly as I paint. and whether if I decide to change things or whatever. I'm never truly satisfied with my color, and I always like to bump it one way or another, and you'll see me doing that throughout this painting. There are some differences in, you guys are looking at a photograph of this setup, and I'm sitting 4 feet away looking with my naked eye at this setup. My eyes aren't as good, as they used to be, so I'm not seeing it quite as sharp as I would if I had my reading glasses on and a photo right in front of me, just like my canvas. So there's a little bit of difference in what I'm looking at and what you're looking at. And then furthermore, once I got beyond the bottle, and even I say bottle, the glass vase, once I got beyond the glass vase, I basically tried to paint this glass vase without really changing anything. I liked the way the stems looked, underneath the water line, and I just decided I was going to paint it basically the way it was. But I also say that I think I ended up being slightly fatter at the end or whatever, and that's, I'm not going to worry about that. I don't really care if mine's a little fatter than that one or a little tall. I just want it to be a pretty vase. No one's going to see the original. But once I got up into the grass and into the background, I really took all the liberties, anything I wanted to do. I didn't hold back. If I liked it this way, if I decided the grass needed to have an extra stem in it, I just did whatever I wanted. So I'm finally getting these colors in, and as you'll notice, I still am not putting in those very lightest bright reflections. I'm holding off. And yeah, you can see the bottle develop at this point once you get some of those very first highlights in, like I'm starting to put now. You start to see your subject, and you can start to see the three-dimensionality of it and everything else. If you'll notice, the colors of the stem, I went ahead and I'm just painting the whole thing, something like that. I'm just going to paint it with the darker color, and then I'll get the highlight and put it right into that darker color that I've already painted. I'm not going to bother leaving a little blank spot of canvas. I'm just going to take this stronger green and paint it right on top of the other. And this is, even here in these stems, talking about painting abstraction, it's real easy to draw line, line, line. But if you'll notice, it's not really line, line, line. There's, one of the stem that I'm painting right there kind of joins together with the other one at the bottom. You can't even see the difference between the two. It's really not as simple as it looks. And so take those cues from nature whenever you're looking at something like stems or leaves or wrinkled fabric or whatever. I love to look at the source and find the abstraction in it and just paint it. In other words, look for any clues as to how can I paint this clump of leaves without it being leaf, 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 leaf. That's the biggest issue. Your brain, when you look at these stems, you want to paint, just like I've already started to do. You can see how much stronger my stems are line, 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 line. And I'm pretty sure I go back and fix that later on. But that's the tendency, even at this point. So you really try to put stuff in, and there are lines there that indicate stem, but it's just not as much of a pattern as you think it is. So maintaining the abstraction is what this lesson is primarily about, and you're going to see that throughout. But even down here in these simple stems, you've got to maintain the abstraction. Or in the reflection on the bottom of the jar. I keep calling it a jar. So here comes some very light color, and I've really held off, but I feel like I'm sort of getting finished with that area down there. I want to see what it's going to look like. But I'm surprised that I left those stems as distinct as they are. My stems are very much more line, 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 line. They're kind of fused together more in the source. And you'll notice, see the brush I'm using, it's not a detail brush. It's a brush that's, that's about the smallest brush I ever paint with. And one of the reasons I don't like using detail brushes is because they tend to, you get a little more abstraction with a bristle brush. If you, the hairs sticking out, on either side, they create more than just a simple shape. They drag a little couple of extra thin lines on either side of the line you're painting. It's hard to describe, but they just make a little bit more of a mess. And that little teeny bit of messiness is nice. And if you try to paint with a soft detail brush, you get lines, just line, line, line. It's really hard. Either line or you're just filling in with teeny little dashes, and it's not the same. So I've just taught myself over the years to not use those detail brushes. Even when I'm putting a shine in somebody's eye, I like to use a small filbert with a teeny bit of bristleness to it so that I can get a little bit more of an abstract shape every time I touch my brush to the canvas. I think I'm seeing some color over there. And a lot of these colors, one of the things that happens when we took a picture of this still life, I was not sitting in the chair, and so there may be some reflection coming off of me as I sit in the chair that you're not seeing. So it's not a perfect photo, but that's just, I was just working from live. So now I'm starting on the background, and as you can see, the camera is out of focus. That was my fault. It's just every single time you sit down, I've got to refocus the thing, and if the camera turns off and back on by itself, the focus gets off. But as you can see, you get the gist of what I've done. This isn't going to take us long to get through this, but I'm just painting darks. And then the second step, so I've painted all the darks in, and it's just a pattern I see in the cloth. And now I'm painting all the third step in. The second step I've already painted. And I'll just go through my steps like that until I get the whole background put in. And you'll see it in focus once I get finished. But I'm just going through my steps and just filling in. And one of the things that I do when I fill in a canvas is I try not to actually think too much. I look over at what I'm painting and I fill in without giving any. It's real easy to look at a pattern and start to want to paint more of a pattern. But I literally, once I have those black lines put in and I'm just filling in, it's like I'm doing, crayon paint, coloring. And I'm just filling in the blank areas and letting the pattern that was already created continue to maintain itself. Because otherwise, if you start painting and playing, you take the pattern out, or actually you take the pattern out that was the abstract pattern out, and you put in a new pattern which is much more contrived. So these are the very lightest colors in the background. And as I said before, I ended up changing this background 2 or 3 times, and I don't even like the last one that I painted. This first one here, I changed it, and I think I I'm not sure which background I like the most, but I'm not sure that all the work that I put into it was worth it. Now, when I'm painting these dried grass, it's the same old thing. I'm putting in the very darkest colors that I see first and just kind of building it like that. And it really, a lot of this is just me. If you notice the dance that my brush does, it's almost weird the way that I paint or the way that I move, and some people ask me what in the world I'm doing. But I think it's a product of years and years of trying to paint abstract, and I do this mental game in my head that I can't even describe, but it's like I'm always hesitant to do the thing that I want to do. And that sounds really strange, but if I think, oh, I shouldn't put a dark spot there, well, then I'll put it there anyway. And it's not exactly like that, but it's some kind of weird thing. And it also affects the way my brush dances around. And if you can see, there's kind of a shake to it. And I twist it, and I move it, and I do weird things. And I don't even know, it's hard to describe, but it's this very strong. The whole time I'm painting what I see, but I'm trying my hardest not to paint a pattern. And it's really hard to not do that. And yet I have to put in some indication of stems, and so I just go for it. And I'm definitely looking at my source for clues, looking for shapes that are not necessarily stem shapes, and putting some of those in. But it's a constant back and forth and trying to figure out some way to maintain an abstract pattern without it becoming this, very regular series of dashes, as an amateur will just tend to do. And see how I'm pressing my brush on the canvas and brushing and moving it in odd ways. It's just a dance that I've developed over the years whenever I'm painting something that's abstract. And you're going to have to just develop your own. This is all driven by me looking at the still life as I paint and asking myself, does my painting have more of a pattern than I'm actually seeing? And I'll put my eyes out of focus, whatever it is I do, but I'll look over at the still life and I'll just ask myself, does the pattern seem stronger in the puff of seeds than it does in my painting? And if the pattern does seem stronger, then I'll take my brush and I'll smush it on the canvas or push it sideways or dash in a black shape where I see one in the still life or whatever it is. But be keenly aware about, is there more of a pattern in my leaves or cloth or whatever it is you're painting? And you can, it's not hard. I mean, I've seen so many students who they'll finish the whole painting and there's obviously more of a pattern in their leaves or their flowers or whatever it is they're painting than is in the still life. And all it takes is for me to ask them and point it out and say, do you see how there's more of a pattern in your leaves? And they say, yeah, I see what you're talking about. Well, you can ask yourself the question just as easily as I can. So just always be asking yourself. Never increase the pattern. It's, when you're sitting there painting it, it sure is fun. It sure is fun to paint patterns. And we tend to like order and structure in some sort of subconscious way, and we are always trying to put patterns in. But all it takes is for you to step back, look at your source, and say, where is there more of a pattern? And if there's more of a pattern in what you're doing, then wipe it off, scratch it, smear your brush on it, wipe it off, add more to it, whatever it takes. One of the things I do a lot is just roll my brush across the canvas. I'm sort of doing that now, using the edges of the filbert brush. As you roll it, it creates a weird zigzag. This is pretty deliberate because it's a very distinct blade of grass. This is one of the advantages of painting wet and wet. If you tried to paint that grass blade on top of dried paint, it's much harder because then once you lay it in, you can't do anything to it. And as you'll see, I'm going to play with these things, wipe them off, repaint them. But having that wet and wet is what really gives it that nice little blend as it trails off. And even on the edges, in a way that you can't see, there's a way that the paint all works together, and you just don't get that when you're working wet and dry. It's just a lot harder to deal with. The edges of these seed pods is where that's where you really get the definition of it. And that's where you see, kind of understand what you're looking at, of those little funky edges where the dried seeds stick out. Like that. This painting was actually, one of the nice things about the background is it had so much burnt umber in it, because it was so brown, that I could get away a lot more with blending those edges, because normally if you take a lighter color that has a lot of titanium white in it and blend it into the background, you get all this milky, blue milky mess that really doesn't work. But burnt umber, you can blend into it, and it doesn't. The colors tend to stay more natural. And in this case, it was almost perfect. It's always easier to work on brown backgrounds. Burnt umber just always blends wonderfully with whites or anything else. Unlike blue, blue will just come out and turn everything to gray. So this is just an abstract pattern that really is, when you're looking at it up close, it doesn't look like seeds or grass or anything, especially if you're sitting there life-size like I was, staring at it, 3 feet in front of my face or 2 feet in front of my face. But I'm constantly just analyzing the pattern and the abstraction, and not worrying at all about making messes on the canvas, as long as my mess looks like what I'm painting. And you can see in there all those grays in the stems there. Those are no good. I'm going to have to come back in there and put some color. Anytime you get gray or milkiness, you can always take some burnt umber or some orange and throw it in there and get rid of it. But some gray is good. So now it's, what's the difference point where I'm just looking at the still life and I'm asking myself, what's the difference between what I'm painting and what I see over there? And the color I don't like, so I'm taking some orange here. Far stronger than anything I would actually end up leaving in the painting probably. But by just dabbing my brush in here and there and rolling it across the surface and putting in these really strong little bits of orange, it's killing all the milkiness very quickly. So I just decided I didn't like the color, and the easiest way to change that is just to go grab some pure color and just touch it here and there. It's another huge advantage to working wet and wet, is you can alter the color so easily. Just go in there and add some blue to it, red to it, yellow, whatever you want. You just mix it right in, and you can change the color right on the canvas. And to any degree, you know, if you're working on dry canvas with another color, you pretty much have to paint that color on top. But when you're working wet and wet, you can take the color and blend it into the color that's already there and get a wonderful compromise. And you can also change things like I'm doing here with this grass. And if you look at the tip of that grass, as it blended into the background, it made a wonderful, nice color. Well, you're not going to get that if you're painting on top of dry paint. You know, I'm spoiled because my entire career I've always worked wet and wet. And those few times when I have to work wet on dry, you know, I just notice how much harder it is. But sometimes you have to, you know, like in this painting, I didn't finish it. I had to stop working on the still life and go do some other things that I had to do, and the painting dried on me. So when I painted the bottom half, I had to work some wet paint into the dry paint. And there's a way to do that. But as far as being able to go in and really change things and play with things like I'm doing here by putting, you know, I decided it needed a lot more red in the shadows. So I just go and put it in. And as you can see, by just playing with it a little bit, you can tone it down. If I want to put some more green back into it, I can do that just as easily. But I love working in wet paint. Like when I drag this brush into that background, it just trails off perfectly. And that's not going to happen if you're painting on top of dry paint. So I'm just playing what's the difference. I'm just looking over at the still life and making changes. I wasn't trying to strictly paint it exactly as I saw it, but I always, whenever I'm doing anything abstract, I'm just trying to look for ideas on how to do things. And the reason that green works, and the reason that green, I think, maybe is pretty, at least to me, is because the rest of the colors are so muddy. And that's why I'm always talk about painting a muddy foundation instead of a bright, colorful foundation. Because it's always a lot easier to add color. as you've seen how I've done in this still life, we can just, especially when you're working wet and wet, it's almost sometimes better to mix your color in as you go, because you end up with interesting accidents. You can always look over at your subject and decide how the color should change. Now on this background, I told you I didn't like it, and so I'm making some changes. I went from trying to make it look like fabric to trying to make it look like a, who knows what, carved wood, some kind of a, who knows. I started thinking I was creative, and which I often do, and sometimes you end up coming up with something interesting. But I might like the background as it is right now and wished I would have left it just like it is, and it took me so little work to do. But then I decided that I wanted to really try to make it look like the fabric that was hanging back there, so I went back and changed the background even more. Just working on the edge of the again, trying to introduce the abstraction. That's why I put that little dark mark on the upper seed pod. I played with this background so much, I was just never happy with it for whatever reason. Or I might like it the way it looks now. I don't know. But the way it ended up, who knows, maybe that was the best. I really honestly can't tell you which one I think is best. But I think anywhere in here, there were several times where I think it was possibly just as good as I ended up with after working on it and working on it and working on it. It felt like I maybe overworked it. But I'll probably convince you that I overworked it. And if I just had it in a museum, the more I worked on it, I started to, I don't know, it started to get more variation in color, more dance of color. You put enough mess into something, and you end up having so much more depth of color just because you've been working on it so long and playing with it so long that you end up, getting something interesting. But who knows? Maybe it was best where I finally ended up with it. But just never sure of myself. So the real definition in these seed pods, again, is the way the edge plays, and that's why I do a lot of edge work in creating those little, sharp little points coming out. This was some grass that I actually picked right out in front of my studio. And so here's the still life, and I've removed the front, the grass laying on the table. I decided I didn't want to include that in the composition, and I just decided I didn't like it. And now gone back. I'd stopped painting for about a week or more, and came back, and some of my paint had started to dry, and so I went back, and now what I'm doing is I'm re-wetting, and I'm also painting over that black line because I'm not going to paint the grass, but I'm re-wetting all the areas that I'm going to be blending into. And so I'll mix a color that's real close. It doesn't have to be perfectly exactly the same, but I definitely want to re-wet all the areas so that when I do blend into it, it has a nice, some nice color and a nice blend line and not some sharp edge. So here I'm using my finger to mix that wet paint on top of that dry paint. And it might look a little flat now, but all that'll come back out when I varnish it. Where I rubbed with my finger, there's a little bit of flatness, but the varnish will bring it back. Just putting a little fold in on the table. Again, you can see the advantage of wet and wet. If I had to do this on a dry, painting this on top of a dry paint, I just don't know how I'd do it. And notice these colors will look very different while there's still some of that stain color showing through. But once I get the whole canvas covered, the colors will start to look right, at least to your eye. Now watch how I do this. What I've done is I just painted the whole thing a solid, and now in order to maintain all the abstraction, I'm rolling my brush. If I tried to paint this pattern, I could work at it forever and never make it as abstract as this ends up being. And it's simply because I'm rolling my brush in some kind of crazy way, not even thinking about what I'm doing, that I end up with a real nice, beautiful, abstract pattern. And it took me no time to do that. Some of that's back, the canvas showing through, the stain showing through when I was rolling my brush. That's another thing I do is I'll, drive my bristle tips through the paint to reveal the canvas and get a little bit of the stain color into it, if that's what I'm trying to do. So now I've just got to join those two areas together. And as you can see, since I've already wet that upper part. If I tried to do that on top of dry paint, I just couldn't do it. But it's real easy to blend. And I definitely don't want to over blend. See how I pick up my brush and then set it back down? That's because I don't want this nice, smooth, perfect. I want a little bit of noise in there. This is the highlight of the table out there in the front. This is actually catching some of my studio light, but that was by design. So that front edge of the table is a good step brighter. Changing some of the color in the back edge there and calling it done. Signing it like I usually try to do with the tip of my brush. And here's a shot of the finished painting and a detail shot of the tabletop and detail of the grass and background, and then back to the overall shot of the completed still life. If you're interested in finding out more about the oil colors that I used to paint this still life with, go to genevafineart.com and you can find out more about the oil colors that I used to paint this still life.